catching up on grading hopefully this week. I got a few late submissions for the e-commerce business models, and I will be catching up with those hopefully by the end of the week. Next week, there's a lot of moving parts going on next Wednesday because most of you who aren't in the club know I'm the co-advisor for our Enactus Club, and we have a number of things that are going on next week on Wednesday. So, next Wednesday, I will not be with you for the test. Ms. Dunlap is going to be proctoring that exam for me, and I'll email you this to remind you of this too. We're actually going to be moving this class to Sullivan 112 for that day. It won't affect your ability to take the test. It's all online. It's going to all be using lockdown browser, multiple choice, true and false. All the bonus questions on this exam are based around things we've talked about in class. So if you've been part of the conversation, you have a pretty good shot at doing well on the exam. I will remind you that our test that day is in Sullivan 112. Next Friday, I'm going to be on the road for the School of Business. How many of you are on the New York trip? Remind me. For those of you who are on the New York trip, I'll send you a link to the video. For everybody else, we're going to be doing an in-class film on Amazon and data collection. So you're still required to be here in class. I will be having attendance taken, but we're going to be watching a movie together. So again, guys, we're wrapping up a big part of the theoretical part of the course. We're going to hopefully get into some more applied concepts as we go. Before we get back into the material today, too, I want to also remind you guys something else with this particular course. I'm working on a couple of guest speakers to bring in so we can talk about things like search engine optimization, also talk a little bit more deeply about analytics. Because so much of this class is tying into how business fits in, sometimes we don't get as much time to put tech into it as well. I'm going to be attempting to insert that in the second part of the class as well. As we're going, however, if there's something in particular that you're interested in, hit me up. Like we were talking about the Xbox networks, for example. If there's something in particular you're interested in, we still have plenty of time in the semester to insert that in the class. Even though midterm is technically two and a half weeks away from now, it seems like really we've got more of the semester still ahead of us after midterm, just the way that the break falls. So we've got some time. Any questions before we jump in for today in terms of what we're going to be doing here? Okay. For the folks who are involved in the filming next week, if you guys, the Enactus folks, can give me a minute after class, just to bring you up on some things that just came up. It's all good stuff. So, guys, we left off talking about wireless and Wi-Fi and the fact that a lot of companies are getting into trying to put connectivity into places. Now, guys, let's talk about this for a second. We know, for example, we all go through cellular dead zones. We go through places where there's no Wi-Fi. We go through places where we simply cannot connect. Here's my question for all of you. Why do mobile providers, why do technology companies always think about areas like Loretto last? Why are they always their lowest level of concern? Yes? Amount of people. You got it. And amount of people translates to what? Money. You got it. So, for example, if you have the opportunity to put in 5G in Washington, D.C., or to actually give us reliable 4G in the sticks here, where are you going to put your money, generally speaking? You're going to go in the cities where you have more subscribers, more money to be made, more customers to keep happy. And apparently my reinstall did not help this out either, so I apologize for the massive clicking that I'm going to have to do here. That being said, guys, a number of companies are starting to look at ways to cover these kinds of areas. In particular, we're talking about Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. They're looking outside the United States. For example, Facebook wants to give everybody in India free, what they refer to as limited internet access. Google wants to get into places like the continent of Africa. What is the motivation of these companies to go into some of the lesser developed areas of the world? Why would they want to? Yes?
To make it more developed so they can start making money there.
Exactly right. They want to build a consumer base there. In fact, India actually pushed back against Facebook because they basically said, all you're going to do is give us limited internet. All you're trying to do is build more Facebook customers. In reality, is there a good chance that's one of the things that Mark Zuckerberg was pushing toward? Yeah, I think that's incredibly possible. We're going to start off today, though, showing you some of this tech in action. One of the more compelling concepts or projects, I think, is Google's Project Loon. And this is really an interesting approach to covering wide swaths of territory, and it does have an e-commerce aspect. So sit back, we're going to watch a brief video about how Google wants to get everybody. Go ahead. I thought you were.
Sorry, I didn't do something. satellite attached.
Yeah, that part of things does not sound all that attractive. I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, I was about to say that will work until like any storm comes and just sends that thing.
Well, keep in mind, as far up as they are, though, you're getting above the clouds. You know, so you're not really talking about weather patterns.
It's probably way oversimplified the part with the aircraft traffic though. Like, it's not just like you call them up and say, hey, the satellite's about to fall. You know, they have like planes and stuff that are in danger of being hit.
Yeah, for example, planes can get taken down by birds, let alone falling data repeaters. I mean, that's definitely a concern. But why balloons instead of towers? Like, what was the fundamental concept there? Yes.
I guess it's just like there's not like a physical structure that has to be put down on the ground. You can move them anywhere without having such a hassle. You just like, just send them to a different location.
From a cost standpoint, it may be much more efficient than towers. Is there another reason? Yes.
We can reach a wider range of areas.
Yeah, I mean, you're not limited by physical barriers. Guys, a couple of key points we've talked about factor into this equation. Let's think about this for a second. You remember I said a couple of times that the internet and IP networking in general are self-healing networks. How does that apply? One of those nodes goes down, has to come back down. The other ones will still create a network around it. So we've got a network basically that can get bigger or smaller based on how many nodes we're putting up. You remember I also mentioned in the last lecture that the original Wi-Fi signals, for example, operated at 2.4 gigahertz. What also conducts that frequency? Microwave, and what absorbs that frequency? Water. Exactly right. So let's take a look here, guys. If we get into any kind of wireless, let's say, for example, we're putting up a cellular tower in the town of Loretto. And obviously we don't have skyscrapers in Loretto, but we've got homes of varying sizes. All wireless inherently is what we refer to as line of sight. And what that means is anytime you put a barrier between the device you're trying to use and the connection point, i.e. the tower, any barrier soaks up part of it. So we've got this very powerful signal coming through this house, and it'll transmit through the house, but it loses power as it goes through obstacles. Obstacles including walls, including human beings who are good conductors of radiation. And the ground itself is full of water. No matter what, the ground soaks that stuff up. We've got all these physical barriers. And what the thought is, if we can get things up higher, we're able to avoid many of these barriers. Even though if we're still going through things like rooftops, they can have aerials on them. They can have ways to redistribute that stuff. It's a very quick way to distribute an infrastructure. A couple other interesting points, guys. One of the reasons we see so much wireless in places outside the United States, and the reason why cellular got so good in places like Europe and in particularly Asia and Africa more quickly than it did in the United States, we already, number one, had a cabled infrastructure, and number two, when these companies were going in, instead of bothering with wiring, they just knew they would be going wireless from the get-go, and they were exploring these kinds of technologies. Some of the initial attempts to wire Africa completely failed before the era of wireless. And it wasn't just because the continent is large. It's because people were actually digging up the cable and selling it for scrap. If they had to choose between, it's true. If they had to choose between feeding their families or getting wireless internet, they were feeding their families. Two fun stories, but yes.
Going off of that, like, is it worth full time money, get this into like a developing country? Because people actually, have technology, like a phone or something, like a smartphone, to use this. Like, I think there might be more people who don't have the resources to use it than people who actually have it.
It's a valid point. I think the counterpoint to it that I found pretty surprising. More people in the world have cell phones than running water. More people in the world have Facebook than running water. So even people who are in very dire circumstances often have basic technologies. Now, they use them differently than we do. For example, in Africa, back in the 1990s, they used to have what they referred to as bicycle networks. And here's how they worked. You guys all live in a village. You guys live in a village, and I'm the bicycle messenger. These guys literally would carry a wireless repeater, and they would bicycle through your town. They'd stop for a minute. Everybody who had queued up messages on their smartphones would send them to the repeater I was carrying with me. I would bicycle to the next town. You guys would queue them up, and I would pedal back to a central satellite location and upload them once a day. That's how far people were going to connect. crazy, right? People will find a way. And in this modern world, sometimes there are people who don't have what we take for granted. In terms of those balloons and in terms of their capability, this is the two fun stories I'm going to share with you. Number one, anybody here from the Somerset region? Anybody know where Somerset is? 2 years ago, a bunch of guys actually successfully stole an entire cellular tower. And the way they did it over a weekend, one piece at a time on ATVs, on four-wheelers. Over the course of a weekend, a tower literally disappeared. Somebody managed to steal an entire communications tower for scrap. That was one. And number two, the balloons that Google is talking about here, this is how powerful these things are. Somehow, anybody familiar with something called the Darwin Awards? Where people do really dumb things, get awards for them? This guy somehow managed to get his hands on a couple of weather balloons, things that are similar to what Google would use, and had this fantastic idea that he was going to make his own homemade aircraft. He attached these balloons, several of them, to a lawn chair, and decided his plan was to get up to a height where he wanted to go, and he carried a BB gun, an air rifle, to be able to shoot the balloons out one at a time to gently lower himself to the ground. Before he knew it, he was 40,000 feet in the air, showing up on radar and dying from hypothermia. He eventually got entangled in power lines when he did manage to shoot himself part of the way down, and the FAA sued him for operating an unlicensed aircraft. So those balloons truly will work. So that's your non sequitur story. Yes?
Is Google going to control balloons, or is it all based off of the wind?
I can't imagine how they would do anything other than try to predict
Weather
wind patterns.
patterns change, and I don't understand how they would predict where the wind's going to go.
I guess you'd have to look at historical data, and as much as anybody can actually predict the weather, you'd be trying. The counter to that would be just to have so many up there that you hopefully would create enough of a mesh coverage.
So it goes off course that you have another one.
Yeah, that would be the thought. Actually, sorry this is taking so long, guys. The first cell phones, before we had true cellular phones, we had something called iridium, and they were satellite phones. And what they used, if you look at the Earth, the equator is where we have most of our satellites that we rely on. They're what we refer to as geostationary satellites. And so these satellites broadcast to most of the world. They can't hit the poles very well. For example, satellite communications generally don't work that well in the North or South Pole because of the curvature of the Earth. But what companies like Motorola did, they built essentially networks of satellites so that as they were rotating around the globe, there would always be at least one or two overhead. And that's what they would call iridium. That was the original concept for cell phones. So kind of crazy how this stuff has evolved over time. So anyway, guys, there are reasons why these companies want to invest in the developing world. There are reasons why they want to get above the clouds. There are reasons why we don't want to rely on towers anymore. Guys, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Internet of Things because we tie that in a lot with our current events conversations. One of the biggest things, as you recall from our last conversation, the next big step, the next frontier is automobiles and mobile Internet of Things devices. In particular, what companies like Apple and Google are looking at to actually use our phones as car keys, etc. I think the security and privacy concerns kind of illustrate themselves. And we're going to be talking a lot about data gathering in the coming chapters. So me not spending time talking about this now does not mean it's not important. It simply means we're going to be covering a lot of that in the future sections. What we are going to spend a moment to talk about, however, is America's place in governing the Internet, or what used to be our place. Who here has ever even heard of ICANN before? ICANN, by most standards, is the most powerful governing body of the Internet. It was created in the United States. It got turned over to international control about 4 years ago, back in 2016. Very controversial move. A lot of people felt that the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is essentially the biggest determinant of DNS in the world, should have remained in U.S. control. Other folks believe because the Internet is an international resource that it should be turned over to an international institute. We're going to watch a video about ICANN here in a minute too. What I'm putting up here for your consideration, though, all of these groups, which are largely voluntary kind of professional associations, are the folks who come up with the rules and regulations for the Internet. Now, we might think for ourselves, what are some of the things we have to govern? If we think about disputes that can occur on the Internet, what are things that we have to resolve on occasion? I'm thinking business in particular. What might be a business issue that you run into on the internet that you need somebody to help you make a decision? Yes. Tell me more. Absolutely correct. We had the largest data breach in U.S. history about 3 years ago with a company that affects all of us. Who am I talking about? We're still talking about it in the news today. Facebook's good. This one's even more insidious. Equifax. Who here has heard of the Equifax data breach? Who here knows what Equifax is? There are 3 major credit reporting agencies in the United States. 3 total that affect your entire credit life. Equifax got hacked. And if you want to know how they got hacked, it came down to this. And about April or May of the year, I think it was 2017, they realized that their firmware on their servers was not up to date. They didn't bother updating. 2 months later, somebody took an exploit. They were able to hack in based on firmware that should have been easily updated in some of their systems. And they were able to release the credit card information and credit data of about 1.5 million, no, it was actually 15 million Americans. This happened because people who were supposed to be doing their job weren't doing their jobs. Here's the other part too, guys. Equifax knew about the hack in about July. You know when they let the general public know it had happened? Yeah, about September, October. And about 3 weeks before they publicly released the hack, a bunch of executives started selling their stock in the company. So the point is, when we get into this level of governance, even for things like security and what we refer to as due diligence, letting people know what's going on with companies, there are no hard and fast rules for any of this stuff. Let me give you another example why we need governance on the internet. Right around let me ask you the question. If I said, hey guys, we're going to go to this website today. We're going to go to whitehouse.com. What website would you think I was probably going to? You would think it would be the White House. Unless it was the year 2000 or 2001 or 2002, in which case if you went to that website in this class, you'd be rather embarrassed by what you were looking at in front of other people. It was a porn site. Basically, somebody in the early days of the internet thought enough to buy the domain for whitehouse.com, and it was a pornography site, and they held on to it for years until somebody finally said, we'll pay these guys what they want for this web domain. We're going to sell it to somebody else. As a result, for example, there are different tags for domains now. There's .com, there's .edu, and as of about 4 years ago, there's .xxx, meaning people can designate what their content actually is. These statements, and I'm putting this on recording, are not advocating viewing pornography, but it's saying that there have to be ways to make sure people aren't getting tricked into content they do not want to view, because plenty of people were not intending to see what they saw on whitehouse.com. And so that being said, it's very confusing who actually controls this stuff. We're going to show you a brief video about how ICANN actually controls global DNS and why it is a multinational concern. And none of this stuff should be considered to be comprehensive information because there's just too many people fighting. Dominated organization, and it is no longer. It is truly multinational, and it's a somewhat ad hoc democratic process. So when you ask who's in control of the internet, you can pick any of these agencies to say, yes, they play a role, but ICANN is ultimately the most powerful body, and ICANN is truly multinational. Now, do we exert, as the United States, maybe a disproportionate amount of power because of some of the companies that are based here? I would argue that we do. That being right or wrong is up to the individual to decide. But if I ask you guys, who is largely in control of the internet, ICANN is a pretty good answer. Yes, sir.
So all these people govern the internet. Is the dark web like a real thing?
Oh yeah, the dark web is definitely real.
How can they can't control that?
Well, I mean,
it's like how do you even get on the dark web like that? You can't just like Google download an app or something. So I'm assuming they know how to get to it too. I don't know.
Yeah, to be honest with you, man, the dark web, by most estimates, is about 2 to 3 times larger than the actual internet, maybe even bigger. They say that basically we're the tip of the iceberg in terms of the internet you actually see. I'm not a hacker. I've never played on the dark web. And it's one of these things that there are ways to do it. We actually, in some of our cybersecurity classes, there are ways to get on. My biggest understanding of it is you're going to have to know actual addresses to find your gateways in. You're not going to just go in and find a DNS pathway into the dark web. I've never played on it, and to be honest with you, it's one of these things that's kind of like Pandora's box, and I've not felt the need to really touch it. So, yeah. But that being said, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like an electronic Ouija board. You know, once you open that gateway, it probably is something that can't close easily. Has anybody here ever done any work on the dark web that you're willing to admit? What have you guys done?
I mean, you're just exploring it. It's not that exciting. It's just a lot of drugs. It's a lot of drugs and guns.
Yeah. Pirate Bay was always the one that, the site that people point to.
Like dark web, you need something called the Onion Tor browser.
Okay.
That's how you get like what you were saying. That's how you get on it, and you don't even know like the actual address. YouTube. No, I mean,
It's like a private network. That's all it is.
yeah, the name is almost always like hashed. You want to hash it. It's like a block of code that you apply
Hash function, yeah. Yeah, and actually, some of the folks here who are teaching courses on it, I've been talking with one in particular. I think it's John. What is John? Yeah, have him come in and do a little guest lecture on the dark web. For those of you, have you guys taken his class now?
Yeah, I think that's why we've all gone.
Okay. I mean, Pirate Bay was the first big, well-known site from the dark web, and it was really one of the originators of cryptocurrency, because people wanted to be able to have a currency that couldn't be tracked, was not actually real currency to use for buying drugs. It's pretty wild, though. Have any of you guys ever read or explored Pirate Bay? It's pretty wild that they have like user reviews of cocaine on there and drugs. Like, yeah, this AK-47 didn't jam on full automatic mode. This cocaine was fantastic, and 3 stars, would buy again. But that's part of it, guys. I let it up to your own kind of devices to say whether you feel we should be in control of the public internet or if we should be truly multinational about it. I think what it really comes down to, though, is at this point, we've got varying levels of access. The idea being the internet was supposed to be this great unifier where we all had equal access to information, and it's just not that way. If we go to China, for example, the same companies that allow us free and open internet access in this country, like Google, are censoring content in China. Try looking up Tiananmen Square and Google in China, and you won't find much. So, yes, sir.
I just don't like. I guess isn't it hard to have international and governing body when you have all the differences based on like country governments? If you have one governing body that kind of suggests that things are like unified. There's like one right way, but then you have a lot of different countries like China that are very different from like the internet. So like, how do they decide what's right?
I think a good analogy, though, I think you're asking an excellent question, and I think a good analogy to me comes down to even the way we govern the United States. We've got an overarching federal government, but states have rights to make certain decisions. I mean, the one that pops to my brain, just because we were talking about it in Biz 101 today, was the idea of marijuana law. In the United States, technically, marijuana is still a controlled substance. It's illegal by federal law. It is still illegal by federal law. And the DEA chose not to enforce federal law and allow states to decide if they're going to legalize or not. So technically, something's illegal and legal at the same time. And so we get into something like ICANN, and we're trying to make decisions based on cultural preferences and laws. We're talking about making different rules for different countries who are all members of the same consortium because they're basically coming back and saying, ICANN, we like your suggestions, but we're China, so we're going to continue to censor and filter our content. And we're going to also allow our companies to surveil other companies coming into our country, even though we don't want that in the United States. So, yeah, it's messy, and it's not consistent, and there's not one set of rules for everybody. And that's what makes this so complicated. So I think it was pretty interesting that even in the basic animation, they said that part of the reason for having an ad hoc system of governance was to try to stay ahead of the technology because it's moving so quickly. And I think as a result, we end up living in an era where we're dealing with an awful lot of ambiguity. Let me give you an example. And I know we're waxing way more philosophical in here than I expected to be, which is never a bad thing. What's indecent? Like, do we all have the same standards of what people see as decent or not? So how do we legislate? You know, when I think about, and when I say this, the next statement is not meant to start a debate. It's meant to show that we don't all look at things the same way. The different people have a different opinion the day after the Super Bowl about whether or not the halftime show was appropriate. Yeah, and even something as simple as that causes debate. So how do we do things like obscenity laws? How do we govern what's acceptable content for children? In the early days of America Online, for example, an entire group of cancer survivors who had groups dedicated to discussing cancer got banned off America Online. And the reason they did, I'm not making this up, it was a breast cancer survivors group, and they had banned the word breast from being able to be searched because it was associated with pornography. How do you make decisions on these criteria? Do you see what I'm talking about, guys? So, sorry we're getting so philosophical about it, but none of it's easy and none of it is simple. Before I get back into the more linear stuff, any other questions or comments? We'll have to do some more exploration of the dark web, like why somebody from the dark web keeps messing with my recording software. Somebody's listening to me. I think it might be the aliens, actually. They are, or the Joker. Could be the Joker. Any questions before we continue, guys? In terms of limitations where we're at now, guys, one of our limitations still is, depending where you are in the country, we can get times when the internet slows down. You guys ever notice slowdowns on campus, by the way, with your internet speed? Any more? Do you notice it? Back in the old days, here's when you would notice it. If you were on the East Coast, you'd notice you first slow down the day around noon. Why is that? Good. That's a good guess. Yes. Boom. Everybody else is coming online. So all of a sudden, East Coast has had free and open internet since 9 a.m. and at noon, when everybody starts waking up in the West Coast, we used to slow down. So we used to refer to that as peak hour. We don't see so much of that anymore. Latency, again, because we know, for example, we're going through multiple network hops to get anywhere. Sometimes latency means it's taking too long to get somewhere. We still see that problem, particularly in things like video conferencing or other kinds of calls. We also are getting into, as I mentioned before, a lot of our infrastructure digitally is starting to age, and copper wears out just because of connectivity and conductivity. I won't spend a lot of time on it other than to say the Internet 2 initiative is still out there. There's an entire group of people. St. Francis used to be a part of this group until it became too expensive to maintain, who are building their own Internet now, basically to do all the things that commercial commerce on the Internet has destroyed. They're basically saying we're going to have an Internet just for high bandwidth intensive applications, gigabit end-to-end, literally gigabit on the entire network with no bottlenecks. And people like NASA, for example, and Drexel University are doing research on that as well. In terms of where we hit our barriers with the Internet, our big barriers usually are the last mile. In other words, we get out to the towns like Loretto and we're still getting on copper infrastructure. The last mile is where we hit our bottlenecks in our speeds. So the first mile basically goes back to the idea of what we were talking about before, gigapops, fiber optic backbones. You're going to see more substantial investments in the bigger parts of the Internet that carry the big traffic, just like water mains in a city. You design those first before you go out and put the plumbing in the smaller houses. Anytime you have a chance to do fiber on the first mile, it's always going to make for better speed. So, how did we get where we are today, guys? We knew that the Internet itself as a network had its roots in the 1960s. In terms of really understanding where the web came from, the web, for all intents and purposes, was born between 89 and 91. If you've ever heard of Tim Berners, actually, anybody who used Firefox as a browser, or if you've ever used Firefox, the creator of Mozilla was Tim Berners, and he was one of the first folks to really come up with the idea of graphical use on the web. The first version of that was called the Mosaic browser, which later became Netscape. They came up with a web browser that would actually work regardless of operating system, worked on Windows, worked on old Unix platforms. That eventually became Netscape Navigator, which came out for free with things like AOL. And finally, 1995, the year that the internet really hit most people's desktops. Microsoft Internet Explorer. This may not sound like a big deal now, but it was a big deal at the time because when people upgraded to Windows 95, it was the first time a web browser had ever been embedded in an operating system. And all of a sudden, everybody in the world had an internet browser on their desktop. By the way, ultimately got Microsoft sued for antitrust, saying that you are forcing people to use your web browser. This is when we got into the era of hypertext, and the idea being that we could actually have text on pages that would actually take us to other places. For example, we know uniform resource locators give us our domain, they give us our protocol, they give us our addressing. Ultimately, though, the idea of hyperlinks came out during this time in hypertext, meaning we had ways to quickly get between pages. The languages that were coming out at that point in time, HTML was the big one. How many of you, by show of hands, have ever created a website making your own HTML? If I had asked that question 10 years ago, more hands would have come up. Jill, why are we getting away from writing our own HTML these days?
Oh, it's trash. It takes, it's so long to do just, a simple form. It takes forever. So there's a lot faster ways to do it now.
It is so 2001, isn't it not? Yeah, absolutely. We've moved past it. When we get into XML, we're seeing a lot of XML these days. That was really pushed by the mobile revolution. The idea that we were using XML more as something that's a tag-based language, something that was more geared toward mobile. So both of these were created for different purposes. XML really focuses on what data is. HTML is used to make things look a certain way. So we're going to get a little bit more into a discussion of tagging once we get more into designing for the web. The bottom line is if you were getting into designing pages for display, you were using HTML. Don't worry about that distinction too much yet. We are going to talk just briefly as we're closing out our day today, guys. If you remember one thing from our conversation today, other than the lawn chair guy who had to shoot himself down, which was a great story, remember this. A web server can be software or hardware. You can have somebody, if you're talking about a web server, it can be software or hardware. Here's what I mean by that. You still need a physical box for these things to live on. But you can have multiple web servers on the same piece of hardware if you're using something like virtual servers, for example. So a web server can be used as hardware or software. The most common types of server software we're using these days, Apache is very common still because it's based on Unix and it's been around forever. A lot of people are using things like AWS these days and various Microsoft products, for example. But we still do see a lot of Apache out there. What web servers allow us to do essentially are put pages on the internet or put content on the internet or to capture information. So again, we also may have servers that are dedicated to specific reasons. For example, Google has plenty of servers that are dedicated just to providing video. What's one of Google's most popular services these days? Popular pages? You got it. So we got to have dedicated video servers. In the old days, it was not uncommon to have database servers and maybe even some kind of media server on the same physical box. Sometimes we're breaking that stuff out even into specialized servers. Anything that connects to the web, whether it's a browser, whether it is a smart TV, is generically called a client. Again, we get into client-server architecture. We mean we are using a client to access the internet via the service called the web. So, what are we using these days? By show of hands, how many of you use Chrome as your primary browser? How many of you use Safari as your primary browser? Yeah, if you're using Mac, you're probably using Safari. How many of you regularly use a browser I have not described? In the old days, it would have been roughly split between Microsoft, Firefox, and the first stage of Chrome. These days, almost everybody is using Chrome. Yes?
I find it interesting, my job from 2 years ago was through who the people that put you into jobs? I can't think of it. I lost it. Whatever.
It's okay.
It's like where I'm looking, looking at my paychecks and all that, and that website only works on Internet Explorer. It doesn't work on Google.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff was written back then, and actually, Microsoft used to have a really shitty piece of software called FrontPage. Has anybody ever had the misfortune of using that? And they would basically make websites. It was point and click, create like Dreamweaver or whatever program you normally use, and it would insert so much garbage code in there that would only look good on Internet Explorer because they were trying to force people to use the product. So a lot of the sites that were developed in the 90s, early 2Ks were optimized. Looks best in Internet Explorer. I don't even know anybody who's using Microsoft browsers at this point in time. Although Microsoft tried to create a smartphone a couple of times. Anybody here ever had the misfortune of having a Microsoft-powered smartphone? Yeah. Thank your lucky stars. They were terrible. They never cracked that market. They missed the transition to mobile. And they also, at one point in time, guys, had about 70% market share with IE, and they messed that up. BlackBerry messed up market dominance. Microsoft did the same thing. It's amazing what happens when you get complacent. So all that being said, guys, I'm not judging you for whatever browser you are using. So actually, guys, that's a good place. I think we're pretty close to finishing this chapter, but we're going to call it there for today. And I appreciate your time and attention, guys.